So as Giorgio mentioned, just give us a couple of minutes.
Lilian? Can you hear me?
Yep, perfectly, Giorgio.
Maybe we could get started while we try to connect Karim.
Sure, absolutely.
Yeah, because we have quite some people here in the next session, so we have time to go ahead. So
Absolutely.
please, yes, thank you.
Well, a pleasure yet again for all of you who are attending with us. Excited to be with you. My name, as I've mentioned, is Lilian Kidane. I am a partner at the firm Delber Global Advisors, and I'm with you today as the moderator for this exciting session highlighted by Giorgio, which is the decolonialization of the pharmaceutical industry across Africa. I will moderate a panel with two esteemed panelists, one being Giorgio Senyo, who is on the line with us now, and an additional panel member, Karim Ben Daoud, as soon as we can have him rejoin. And we will be discussing topics of how to develop market systems that will break down historical trends and processes that have ensured minimum value on the continent for pharmaceutical industry development, both on the research and the production side. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started. As mentioned, I will be your moderator for the day. We have about 45 minutes left to discuss and debate some key issues on this topic. So as we talk about and define the decolonialization and localization, I want to give you a little bit of the context. So we'll discuss a bit of the context around this topic, and then we will present, Giorgio will present a few slides to illustrate the context as we see it, and we will then dive into a few questions. We'll try to move a little bit quickly, just as we have a little bit less time as planned. So as we get started, to define a bit of the challenge, what we do know is that Africa has fewer than 400 drug manufacturers for about 1.3 billion people on the continent. We know that this is significantly less as compared to some major contenders such as China and India, who have anywhere between 5,000 and 10,000 drug makers. With so few manufacturers here on the continent, we are relying as a continent on imported goods, upwards to 70 to 90%, which of course limits availability, accessibility, and increases the cost of overall access to care. Our overdependence as a continent on imported pharmaceuticals also makes it extremely susceptible to healthcare emergencies, as we've seen particularly with the COVID pandemic. And beyond the current demand for COVID, creating facilities capable of producing vaccines against infectious diseases such as rubella, measles, cholera, and other diseases for which we have no vaccines currently exist, have a huge potential to increase the global supply of such vaccines here on the continent, for us to be a major contender in supplying not only the region's demand, but also global. And therefore, helping us also to protect and ensure the health security of the continent and its people. So in doing so, it also serves to establish a sustainable vaccine manufacturing industry across the region that could stand steady to be deployed at any point in time, including at times of pandemics. Understandably, much of this situation has become far more visible, both politically, financially, through the discussions that have been occurring across the region around COVID vaccine deployment, recognizing that the region has struggled to gain access, mainly because we do not carry the value chains around these vaccines on the continent. And with that, the implication of this is that we were, as a region, receiving limited to last mile deliveries of vaccines much after the global north and other regions globally had received theirs first. Ultimately, the biggest health and economic gains will in fact come from production of these life-saving innovations. So building a vibrant African life sciences manufacturing industry, we know will require, looking forward, quite a bit of investment. Capital investment, investment in what we know are human resources and talent development. We know that technology and knowledge transfer will be critical, and developing strategic market strategies that leverage a regional market, not just country by country, but regionally integrated markets, will be critical in helping us to meet expanding regional demand as well as global. So what we are going to discuss today is how do we get to the center of this conversation in ensuring that we are developing across the region an integrated market-led and demand-led approach that will allow us to break down historical systems that have kept us from developing both the infrastructure, hard infrastructure, as well as soft infrastructure, policy environments and otherwise to be able to advance development of a robust pharmaceutical industry on the continent. And with us today, we have our panelists. First, I mentioned Giorgio Rusino, whom you've all just heard. He has an impressive resume of over 6 decades of service to the continent, serving in many leadership roles, both on the research and academic side, as well as in practice and policy design. Over this time frame, he's carried on regional leadership roles as CEO of the Africa Society for Laboratory Medicine. But most recently, he's the founder of Next to People, an Africa-led organization that just focus on ensuring healthcare access and equity through innovative approaches and unconventional thinking, as well as tested and evidenced approaches to combat poverty, violence towards women and marginalized groups to ensure lasting change. He's also a member of the UNCTAD's Experts Review Committee and a member of the editorial board for the journal Neglected Tropical Diseases. So we thank you, Giorgio, for being with us. We also are hoping to welcome back the second panelist, Karim Bendao, who has spent the last 3 decades in the service of communities and patients, particularly from private sector side, having spent a number of years with the Merck Group, leading the Africa Bureau to develop public sector partnerships and develop commercial opportunities to expand their footprint and ensure access to life-saving medicines across the region. Currently, he serves as the chair of the International Federation for Pharmaceutical Manufacturers and Associations. Thank you both. Giorgio, may I ask that I give you the floor now to present a few of your slides and help us better understand this context that I just laid out, and then we'll follow with a set of questions. Apologies, so I'm not sure, Giorgio, I can see you speaking but cannot hear. That'd be my side.
Oh, sorry. So I would, just as Lilian was mentioning now, I think that what we want to talk about when we talk about decolonization of pharma industry in Africa, and how do we see the future for an African-led pharmaceutical industry. I think that what she has said is very critical. We have over the continent 400 drug manufacturers, more or less. And just to give you a comparison, when we look at China and India, they are talking about 5,000 to 10,000 drug manufacturers, while we have only 400. So that's, with so few drug manufacturers, one can imagine why the reason is that we are having so much relying on imports, and how these imports are becoming more and more expensive for the local industry manufacturer. So, Neo, can we put down my slides on the presentation, my presentation on Africa Bio? So, however, when we look at this, the most important part about the pharmaceutical industry and the biggest health outcome of pharmaceutical industry, not only on the health side, but also on the economic side, come from life science innovation. So really, it's not just manufacturing, just like manufacturing car tires or something else. Pharmaceutical industry becomes really important in country when it is related to life science innovation, and where there will be a long-term demand. So what Lilian was saying, I think, and that should be the mainstream of what we are discussing here, is that building a vibrant African life science manufacturing industry, which obviously requires, on one hand, a capital investment from the private sector, obviously, but that could be public and private, as we have seen from the previous presentation about how financing could be generated with different mechanisms, and the World Bank, the AFC, and probably other national mechanisms that do exist in that part. And then the other one is very important, is technology and knowledge transfer, and that's where also is important thinking about not only local manufacturing, but also leaving enough space also for companies that are visionary enough to transfer the technology for manufacturing over the continent. And of course, then the final point also is that, the business strategies, that one should align the production side also with the expected demand. And one has to overcome the critical issue in many African countries where everything that is manufactured in Africa is not bought by government, that prefer something that is imported from somewhere else. And this, unfortunately, even the South African government doesn't escape this mechanism most of the time. So it's in acquiring and having a very strong pharmaceutical industry in the country, which is R&D oriented, would also overcome that issue. So what is the current situation with drug manufacturing in Africa, if we can talk about that? What is happening in Africa is that drug manufacturing, and we're talking about drug, but the same for vaccine, even though vaccine is a little bit better, as you will hear in the next session at 2:00 p.m. on this same room. Most of the manufacturing in Africa is what we call fill and finish. So the current manufacturer, they just buy the raw material from India and China, bring it in the country, finish the product, and put it in the market. There is no value, really, not much value associated with that, because, first of all, the raw material is bought most of the time. The API, the active pharmaceutical ingredients, are bought from China and India, who are also the competitor in the market then when the country issues national tender for those products, and very difficult for companies in Africa to compete on price, whether they have no control over the API price, because they still have to import it from somewhere else and from the same country that do that. So the real revolution would happen when we will understand the value chain of pharmaceutical industry is much beyond the fill and finish, which is formulation and packaging, but must include the full end-to-end manufacturing, which is including product, research and development. And without that component, pharmaceutical industry is not really an innovation industry. It's just a piece of company that is like an industry that does a little bit of work. So And how do we imagine this? I think that one of the most important part of all this is a fundamental question, is that when we have the objective that we want the African pharmaceutical industry to become R&D oriented, is a strategic objective. And this objective is premised on the belief that knowledge creation and facilitation and adoption of technological and industrial competency is, although a collective and collaborative effort, is primarily the responsibility of the government, because the private sector in Africa simply does not have enough resource needed from that. I don't know if you were at the session before, the main session that we had this morning, and you heard about that. And it is very important. The role of government is very important. We cannot imagine that the pharmaceutical industry in Africa would suddenly become and invest in R&D. And R&D investment is really very heavy in terms of financial contribution. And the industry doesn't have enough market because of what we said before, that the market is, they have to compete with Indian and Chinese company, and their market is relatively small compared to what innovation is created in Europe or in the United States, and even in India and China as we speak today. So the first thing really is that we have to promote the idea that there should be a national system of innovation in country, and should be driven by the state, by the government, institute, very important, and university, academia, and the private sector. And all this, so we have identified what the problem is. We have to think about how do we get around it. And one of the most important things that, to establishment of public-private partnership or product development partnership, which we're going to discuss in the next session in the afternoon. So just to highlight what I've just said, just to remind you, what do we need, or what we imagine when we talk about the value chain in the pharmaceutical industry. And we have to imagine this value chain at national, but also at continental level. The lowest level in the value chain of pharmaceutical manufacturing is importing the products from a country and putting them on the market. Just to remind you that South Africa, which is one of the most evolved pharmaceutical market in Africa, imports maybe 70% of the drugs that are, in fact, on the private market in South Africa. So just to tell you that is the lowest level is when you import the product from outside, because you added no value there except a little bit of value in the distribution and stuff like that. The next step is when you, instead of importing the finished product, you import the raw material and you finish the product locally. You are adding some value there for sure, because you are employing people, you are adding some science, some technology there, and that's the second part. But then the third part is that when you import the raw material, and you are capable of finishing it in a way that is in GMP mechanism, so that is recognized in quality by the World Health Organization, and you can have maybe access to the tender from the Global Fund or from the international funding or organization that do purchase drugs for their programs, and that is a different billion of dollars market potentially. So one can imagine that happens when the company is able to produce in good quality, because that is the fundamental question about it. Now, the third point is that when a country or a continent is capable of producing the active pharmaceutical ingredient, the raw material. And the raw material in Africa, as we speak today, despite the big effort done by the South African Department of Trade and Industry and the Department of Science and Innovation, where a project is ongoing for API manufacturing, in Africa we don't have anything that can compare with India and China. So in Africa, we don't have API manufacturing. And that is really one of the critical issues for developing. That is also a very important part, because having the API manufacturing in country means that you can produce the raw material and then you can supply to African country at regional or even at continental level. And that is a very important step in what we are talking about. Now, once you have that, now we are thinking about Now we have done from local formulation in good quality formulation. Now we're talking about having our own raw material and then finishing the product locally. What is the next step? It's not finished. Now what is the next step is that how do we imagine that we put up a system where we are capable of imagining and producing new drugs, new chemical entities. And that's not a dream, you know, just I always think about this, you know, people, when you say about that we are going to develop new drugs in Africa, people tend to take this as over-optimistic statement. I always say something that we all learn from Madiba, that is, it always looks impossible until it's done. So it is possible, and you know, it was the same thing 10 years ago in India. People were saying it will never happen in China, you know, and it's happening because there is a lot of capacity. There are young people in this continent that are capable of developing. So we have to imagine that. So once we have done our own local products, then the capacity in clinical research should be strengthened. South Africa is already very well advanced, and many other components in Africa are. And then we have to think about new chemistry routes and integrated platforms, which means that even in the raw material, we have to be competing now with the Indian and Chinese that have been producing raw material for the last 20 years and invading the whole market. So we have to be innovative enough as to imagine new ways of imagining new chemical entities, as you can see in the slides here. Oh, finally we have some color in this, and I'm sorry I've been talking so much. And so as you can see, these are the routes once you have your API manufacturing, which is there, and API manufacturing and when we imagine that value chain, please, let's not imagine that it's all in one country. There is not one country alone that could do all these things. We have to think about Africa as a continent, as a region, and the possibility of regional cooperation. We're talking about SADC, and people have a similar organization in East Africa, and West Africa, and North Africa. So we have to imagine that this value chain could be, in fact, the capacity could be distributed at regional level. Some countries would have local formulation with good quality, perfect. Another country will have manufacturing of raw material. So when that value chain at regional level will all complement in one vision that we are having an innovation and an innovative R&D-based pharmaceutical industry. And at the end, you know, of all this chain of what we are dreaming, we have to think about natural products. And most of the natural products, most of the antibiotics that we are using currently, maybe 80 or 90%, they all come from natural products. So there is a lot, and these natural products, Africa is very rich. It's the richest continent in the world for natural products. We need to be capable enough to use those and to imagine that we will be one day capable of moving from those natural products in new chemical entities. This is really sort of a dream of what we want to do. But so let me come back to the next slide, the final one, thank you. Or you want me to do this? Or next. Oh, sorry. You do it or I do it? I do it. Okay, so this is the one. And this is really, as I said before, you know, one cannot imagine that we are dreaming all these things and thinking that suddenly the private sector will be able and capable of doing all this kind of stuff. We have to be strong enough in terms of civil society, academia, people really that have the future of pharmaceutical industry in Africa at heart, to make pressure and to make sure that government plays its part is very important, because donor we can find, as we have seen now suddenly with the COVID situation in Africa, the funding has become available from the European Union, $1 billion, and people are really now suddenly reminded that it is so important to have Africa as a center for pharmaceutical manufacturing. So money will be available, but the willingness and the will of government is really very important. And here are a few of the components that we must require governments to commit to create a society that is based on science and technology, create this atmosphere in the country where science is rewarded. You know, I was very moved today when even here by Africa, young scientists have been rewarded and have been, this is very important, you know, that's how you create a culture of innovation in a country. And this is happening in South Africa. It has to happen all over the continent. We don't have to think that South Africa is Africa. South Africa is Africa, but it's not, we have a bigger continent there, and we need to fight for them also. So what we need really from government is that government should prioritize science and technology, and that should be in a coordination of a policy that should also be based on public consent. Really involving civil society in this discussion is very important, because the patient, they will know better than anyone how important it is to have drugs that are effective, cost-effective, and cheap, available in the country, and how important it is for this, for every country to have an innovative science-based society. So this is very important. And what have been discussed even before about IP policy, I think that this is also a very important thing. And IP policy, even though can be seen in some areas as something that is limiting the access to drugs from some sector of society, is something that need to be discussed, and this need to be discussed at continental level. And I think that the African Union and even the African CDC should come up with some sort of continental guidelines about how are we going to approach the IP when we will be able to develop new drugs in Africa, and would that be available under the same IP policy that have been negotiated all over the world. And then the role of public research institutes is very important, the human resources, the incubation, the incubators, the supporting industries, and finally the patient needs, you know, the involvement of civil society. So I think I took more than my time, Lilian. I'm so sorry, but that was my last slide. Thank you very much.
Joe, that was wonderful. Thank you so much. And I believe we do not have our second panelist, so I am going to be thought-provoking and play the role as both moderator and panelist, contributing to the points that you've highlighted. And I'd like to open it up to others if they have other comments that they'd like to contribute as well. Jojo, to the point that you had made about governments and government prioritization, I wanted to ask your thought a little bit about the competition that has been created in some cases between governments, as you said, all governments or many governments trying to be chiefs across each of their respective areas. And so as we have countries all trying to produce what appears to be similar products, or similar sets of products, and what we then see is feedback from private sector being that what that for them creates is fragmentation and the commercial opportunity across the region, meaning no one country by itself is a big enough market, maybe aside from the likes of South Africa and Egypt. No single market in Africa is alone big enough, but a regional market or sub-regional markets, such as an East Africa market, Southern African market, does present a viable and exciting opportunity for private sector to then come in, partner either with government or a set of local partners to then develop opportunities to supply Africa, but beyond Africa, global markets. So in terms of what we now see as countries that are essentially creating competition between each other, rather than creating synergies, as one country decides to prioritize a select set of products, another country may decide to complement that by providing inputs, as you've highlighted, Giorgio, inputs that would be valuable for that value chain, so that collectively we are localizing as much of the value chain, end-to-end value chain on the continent across countries as possible. It's creating more of a commercially viable opportunity. What are your thoughts on how we could go about doing that? You've highlighted examples of the role that CDC could play, the role that government leaders and government as a whole can play, the need to have IP protection as countries are starting to develop and invest in their own innovation across these value chains, particularly upstream. on the innovation side, on the development side. But how do we bring all of that together strategically so that there is a clear strategic plan that we then can bang our hands on the table and say, you know, Africa is ready, and Africa owns a vision of its pharmaceutical development pathways that we expect and demand that partners and investors and financiers will then participate in. Over.
Yeah, thank you, Lillian. I think that's a very good question because it's something that always comes up in the discussion, you know, how is that going to happen? I think there are two levels here. One is the competition, which is pharmaceutical industry and imagining that based in some region and producing products and some other in another region producing other products and the competition for the same market and the same thing. I think that is that would have to be according to the law of the market somehow, you know, in the sense that that happens all over in the world, in China, in India, where there are so many drug manufacturers, they compete with each other based on their capacity to be innovative. So even with the generic products, each company comes with a new formulation, you know, they have a new pediatric taste for children or something that, you know, it's a little bit appealing to the market, then let the market fix that competition. But then there is another thing that is very important, which is really when we are talking about products that are more related to endemics like the COVID-19, like what happened with recent and then even with the HIV, with tuberculosis, malaria, and other public health needs that are so common and prevalent in Africa, then it's a different story because now we are talking about relatively access for those products for countries and people that don't have the means otherwise to have access to it. And that's what we are going to discuss the next step, the next session at 2 o'clock always here, which, you know, is about thinking product development partnership. And that's what it is about, is, you know, when you are capable of thinking that it will exist product development partnership that will have the role of developing products, and they would have access to financing from government and from other international institutions to develop those products, and these are based in Africa. And these products then, with the only condition that the product should be available at a very cheap price for the public health sector in the different countries. This would somehow leverage the competition or put everybody on the same field, and that's where the IP would then be applied in a different way than for the private market for other pathologies. I think this would be the way that one could approach this one, Lillian. That's what I think.
As we think about, thank you, Giorgio. And I, just to chime in on that, I do agree with you. I think there's opportunity where alongside these pathways that we're currently exploring, and organizations like IFC, CDC, and others have shown interest in working together to identify, is ensuring that we're looking at a market-driven, demand-driven approach. So what that means is, you know, we see some early successes with some of which are highlighted in the South Africa market, where we're seeing global players, global private sector manufacturers coming into the region and signing into partnerships with governments for some preliminary engagement. But as you said, mostly on final stage production activities, and not so much on the upstream spaces of production. So on, for example, in the API space. And so as we think about what conditions would have to be true to get more meaningful engagement or more localization of value chains on the continent, I think we are seeing that there is some early interest, but that the real challenge, as you highlighted earlier on, is to say who is really going to drive this demand. And what that I mean is how are governments going to be to show up, to show their willingness and ability to pay for these products, and for us to challenge donors such as Global Fund, Gavi, and others who play a key role in financing alongside governments for essential medicines and drugs, and ask them to play a role in ensuring that they are driving demand for locally manufactured products. At times, what we hear, and I'd like to hear your thought on this, Giorgio, is that though there is a nationalistic interest from governments in building up pharmaceutical capabilities in country, that the willingness to pay for locally manufactured generic products is not quite so high. And what that is that there is an implication that governments are more inclined to want to secure imported products rather than advancing procurement of regionally produced generic alternatives. I wanted to ask you if you have any thoughts on what is it that governments and other stakeholders can do to start driving a bit more of the demand and willingness to pay by actors in the financing space for these locally manufactured products so that we can drive demand higher.
Yeah, thank you, Lilian. I think, I'll give you a couple of very good examples. I've been involved, as you know, with the development of the Ethiopian pharmaceutical industry strategy a few years ago. And one of the point was, what kind of incentive should the government put in place for pharmaceutical industry in order for them to grow and to attract even foreign direct investment in the country and to develop new pharmaceutical industry in the country. And this problem of the price have been mentioned many times. Even here in South Africa, there's been a case many times where government in a public tender would not buy products manufactured locally because they would not be competitive in price with similar products imported from China and India, because, as we said before, they are the one that produce the API, and their products will always be cheaper than what we can produce in Africa. So the government here in many instances is changing now, I'm told, but has been rather not very keen to buy locally. So what is happening currently in Ethiopia, for example, is that in a public tender, if the product is manufactured locally, it will always have 15% price benefit, in the sense that if I am a local manufacturer, my product can be 15% more expensive than the cheapest products of the same imported products, and government will buy from me rather than buy from an imported product. That's one. And the other one is that they could, for some particular kind of products that can be produced and can cover the whole need for 1 year for that products for the whole country, they could close the market and give a contract to the manufacturing company to say, okay, we're going to buy from you for the next 3 years. We fix the price and we don't put these products into the tender anymore, in order to encourage the local manufacturing and to encourage local industry to be a little bit more viable. So these are few of the things that can happen. And this, this could be, we always thought that this was something that would also be attractive to foreign companies to come in the country, manufacture, because, whatever is manufactured locally would have a better access to local markets. It's not happening as much as we intended or hoped for, but I'm sure that this is the right way of doing, where government should really value, and part of its commitment should be to encourage local industry in this way. Thank you.
Thank you, Giorgio. I know we're running at the end of the panel time, and I do want to respect the hour that all of the attendees in the room with you have availed to us. So in terms of discussing what we've gotten to so far, I think we've talked quite a bit about decolonialization being really about how do we deconstruct the systems, the processes, the interests that underlying development of pharmaceutical industry and try to bring more of the financial benefit, governance structures, value chain from external markets into the continent, so that Africa is not only just the beneficiaries of the drugs and the life-saving products and essential medicines, but also as patients, but also as beneficiaries of the economic returns and social gains that we receive by localizing value chains on the continent. And what will that take? As you've mentioned, Giorgio, there's been some discussion in previous panels around the financing aspect. We talked quite a bit about today around the role of government in setting the agenda and setting the prioritization of pharmaceutical as a priority as part of the development of the nation state and its economic trajectories, but also talking about the integration of a regional market as really being the competitive differentiator that Africa carries that can continue to rival other markets and serve as an interest, a commercial interest to bring more global players onto the continent. We've been seeing some early successes, as mentioned. We have countries like Kenya, South Africa, Rwanda, Senegal. We're serving as kind of WHO-sanctioned hubs for pharmaceutical manufacturing. But we are also seeing the need to continue to have better planning, strategic commercial planning across the continent alongside government to optimize for what could be more of an integrated market across the region and ensuring that we are seeing each other as essentially partners in development of value chain across key product areas. We see the need to do a bit more analysis and defining ranges of products that either can be innovative products, newly developed on the continent, as you said, Giorgio. Things are only, as Mandela mentioned, things are only impossible until we see them realized. And so where are there opportunities to develop new vaccines and drugs that may not exist globally yet? Vis-a-vis, where are there products where there's just high demand, both ability and willingness to pay on the continent, that we could also prioritize for drug manufacturing and medicine manufacturing and research on the continent. We've also touched on, but I don't think we adequately discussed, so I hope participants that are out there with you continue this dialogue. We did discuss what is it that would need to be true to ensure that we are learning from the past, from our experience across pandemics, from everything from the HIV pandemic that of course we're still continuing to respond to, all the way through the Ebola pandemic, and now what we are seeing across COVID, and thinking about the health security of the region, and that pharmaceutical manufacturing is just not a good economic case for developing economic benefits, but really for ensuring the security of our population and our people for what will most likely be another pandemic in future years. And leveraging, therefore, the funding, the political momentum that has been developed most recently with COVID to start developing legacy infrastructure around pharmaceutical manufacturing and pandemic response on the continent. So not losing this opportunity that we have now around COVID conversations to start setting the foundation or advancing and accelerating the foundation that we require to advance pharmaceutical research and manufacturing on the continent. And as Africa continuing to push and drive these critical conversations until we get to tangible pathways to get us to success in a reasonable time frame. So thank you all who joined us for this panel. Apologies again that we started a bit late, but I hope that you felt that some of the topics and points that were raised continue to be points of discussion for all of us to continue to develop perspectives. And I encourage you all to continue to share those perspectives, both within the BioAfrica conference, as well as in other forums, so that we can continue to drive the localization agenda for pharmaceutical research and manufacturing and benefit of continental health security for the region. So thank you all, and most importantly, Giorgio, thank you for joining this panel.
Yeah, thank you,
Wishing you all a good
Lillian.
day.
Thank you so much, Lillian. And allow me to ask maybe if there's anyone who wants to ask any question or any clarification on what has been discussed so far. You're welcome. No, it seems that there is no one. So thank you, Lillian, and really was very good chairing. And I just want to remind you that at 2 o'clock we will go on to the next step and looking at we have looked at all what is the partnership, global partnership, how can they be defined. We have seen what is missing in the product development in Africa. And we will discuss in late the next session on what might be a good thing that we can think about, which is product development partnership as an African-led initiative. So thank you very much. Thank you, Lillian, and have a good lunch, and see you at 2 o'clock. Thank you.
Recording in progress.